So you look at the Montreal Canadiens of the 1970s, that was 6 cups. But the lost cup, what a lot of people believe, is when they played the Buffalo Sabres in the 1975 playoffs. Although Buffalo had the French connection, Montreal was a better offensive team in every shape or form than Buffalo. Were it not for 2 overtime wins by Buffalo, both at home, Montreal would probably win in 6 games, just some bad luck. Now, Montreal entered the series as this is the second time they met in the postseason. They had met in '73 with the rise of the French connection. Now, ironically, Buffalo dominated the regular season, winning 9 of 10 points during the campaign. However, Montreal came ready to play. The first game at the odd, Guy Lapointe gave Montreal an early 1-0 lead at the 32-second mark, past, I think it was Jerry Desjardins. Martin then scored at 5:12 with René Robert scoring 11:22. Lafleur, who had a great series, scored 18:29 in the first. But Rick Dudley, of all people, the future Montreal Canadiens executive, made it 3-1. Now, what really hurt Montreal in all the games of the series, especially in the first, they weren't scoring much or were trailing. In the second period, Lapointe tied it up, but Gilbert Perreault, with a great effort, scored at 18:15. Now, in the second as well, Cornway scored to give them a better advantage, and Perreault tied it up. Now, in the third, Jim Lorentz, the bat killer, scored at 4:20. With Jacques Lemaire, who was kind of quiet in the series, scored at 19:36 to send it to overtime. Now, and of course, in overtime, Montreal had a few chances, but it was the great young prospect Danny Gare, he's fourth to the postseason, scored at 4:42. Now, game two, Roger Crozier took over for Desjardins, and of all people, that big scorer, Don Lou, scored at 17:20. And then Jim Lorentz again made it 2-0. From there, it was a very interesting contest. Lambert's first of the postseason that year scored 11:22, with Craig Ramsey scoring at 1:27 of the third to make it 3-1. And of all players, Henri Richard, where he was brought on for some energy, was a failed shot from the point. He got the puck and he put it past Crozier for his last professional goal. And of course, the kicker was a late goal by Danny Gare to make it 4-2. So they're saying they're going back to Montreal. What's going to happen here in Montreal? Well, what happened? Buffalo gets blown out. They gave up 15 goals in two games. In the first contest, Montreal struck in a power play early at 1:38 on a goal by the Little M, with Guy Lafleur scoring at 18:56. He's 7 in the postseason. In the second, Lemaire scored. And the third, it was Lambert, Risebrough, Lafleur again for the second of the contest at 14:55, and he scored 27 seconds later to seal the hat trick. Kenny Dryden had a better game in Montreal than they had Buffalo in Game 2, with Desjardins and Crozier splitting duties. In Game 4, again, a big Buffalo blow. Buffalo got blown out. Bob Gainey led the charge early in the first 8-minute mark to make it 1-0 after 1-1 after Don Lou scored on a shorthanded at 6:42. Lemaire scored a power play to make it 2-1, and in the second, Lafleur and Lambert again scored. And the third, Lafleur, Lambert, Guy Lapointe, and of all people, Glenn Sader, who had no right to be in that team that year, scored. And of course, Jerry Korab replied for Buffalo. Now, going back to Buffalo, who were thinking to yourself, hey, Montreal's going to do it. But again, a bad start to the first period. Craig Ramsey at 2:18 made it 1-0. And Lemaire tied it. Freddie Stanfield, he's second to Fermo Bruin. And Gilbert Perreault on the power play 7:03 made it 3-1 before Yvan Conroyer, who skated miles in the series, scored at 19:53 to make it 3-2. Now, the youth core, which included Doug Risebrough, he scored at 8:40 to tie it. Then Jimmy Roberts put them ahead, and Montreal was well on their way to win the contest. They held the lead for over 11 minutes, but Craig Ramsey on the power play made it 4-4. And of all people, again, who also had a big goal against the Flyers next, René Robert scored at 5:56 of overtime. Back in Montreal, the killer again was Craig Ramsey. He scored a shorthanded goal at 2:05. Ramsey and Luce were very defensive, offensive stalwarts. Peter Mahovlich scored to make it 1-1, but before the end of the period, of course, Rick Martin, Peter McNabb, so it was 3-1 after 1. Lorentz made it 4-1. Montreal made a comeback in the third on Guy Lafleur's 12th, and Peter Mahov at 18:55, but 4-3 was a little bit too little, too late. Now you're saying to yourself, how in the hell did Montreal outscore them 10 goals and still lose the series? Well, like I said, we're still a team in transition. You had a lot of young players. Henri Richard came off of injury. You had the rising Steve Shutt. You had Tremblay, Risebrough, Lambert. You still had Jimmy Roberts. You still had, Leperrier was gone. So Larry Robinson wasn't too much of a factor in the series. But I think the big thing is you couldn't win in Buffalo, and I'll tell you why. The momentum of the Buffalo fans, especially in the first period, it was like playing the Flyers, and I think they learned how to beat the Flyers in Philadelphia for how they lost at the odd. Like I said, 2 overtime games go to Buffalo, a 4-3 victory, and a 4-2 win late. So technically, 3 goals did him in. And why was Glenn Sader getting a regular shift there? He wasn't going to defense Don Orey the same way. But you look at Buffalo, the key players scored. Martin, Robert, Jimmy Lorentz had some key goals. Danny Gare, Don Luce, and Craig Ramsey. That's the players that needed a score for them to win. Now, I don't know if there's ever been a 7-0 shutout in the semifinal round since then. But like I said, Montreal's offense was split between the top 12. But with Buffalo, I don't think Brian Spencer did much. Other players. And ironically, ladies and gentlemen, even though he's not my direct family, Larry Carrier, who was the first member of my extended family, although he spells his name differently, probably was they used to call him Carrier. Very interesting because people in New Brunswick, and during that series in New Brunswick, we've had heavy snowstorms. In that set, a lot of people couldn't watch the series because either the power went out or they couldn't go to a local bar to see it on, high-def TV at the time. So again, 1975 Buffalo Sabres. And playing the Flyers, something I forgot, by the way, Bernie Perron was injured against the Islanders, I think it was game 2 of the series. And there was some question he was going to make it for the final. And of course, that was his last gasp. But because the following year, he was injured again. And Wayne Stevenson played. I don't think Montreal would be hard-pressed to beat Perron because Stevenson, you look at games 3 and 4 at the Spectrum, he was very weak on the goals by Bouchard, on Shutt, and the other one by Mahovich. But Lafleur's scoring prowess, and don't forget this was the big battle, like Perreault against Lafleur. I don't think Buffalo was ever the same after that, because remember that's the later on he bet the Soviet wings in early '76, but that's the last great gasp of the Sabres. And I don't think the Flyers would have bet Buffalo if Perron was injured. I think they lucked out because Perron was the straw that stirred the drink. It's sort of like Jim Catfish Hunter with the Yankees. Even though he's old and aged, he's still going to win. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of the 1974-75 semifinal round by Buffalo, where they won their Prince of Wales trophy. If you like what they're doing here with our spectacular podcast, let us know with a like, comment, subscribe, or share.